Ethan thought it was just another rainy night, another quiet stop at his favorite diner after a long day. But when a mysterious woman walked in, drenched and looking completely out of place, everything changed. A simple act of kindness led to something deeper. But what happens when the truth comes out? When secrets unravel and identities are revealed? Will their connection survive, or was it all just an illusion? The rain poured heavily, turning the streets into a blur of glistening puddles. The Silver Spoon Diner, a small but cozy spot on the edge of town, stood out like a warm beacon in the cold, wet night. Inside, the soft glow of lights reflected off the chrome stools, and the air was filled with the rich aroma of fresh coffee. A jukebox in the corner played an old song, adding to the diner's familiar charm. Only a few regulars sat at their usual booths, quietly enjoying their late-night meals. Ethan sat at the counter, his hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. It had been a long day at the auto shop fixing cars, dealing with impatient customers and getting covered in grease. His clothes smelled like oil, and his fingers were rough from hours of hard work. But this diner was his escape, a place where he could just sit and let the world slow down for a while. Then, the door opened with a soft chime, and a woman rushed in. She was completely drenched, water dripping from her coat onto the floor. Her damp hair clung to her face as she scanned the diner, nervously, before hurrying to a booth in the corner. Ethan noticed her right away. She didn't seem like someone who belonged in a small-town diner. Her coat looked expensive, her boots barely had a scratch on them, and the way she moved had a certain elegance. But what caught his attention was the expression on her face. She looked worried, as if she was carrying the weight of something heavy. A waitress approached her table and handed her a menu. Ethan tried not to stare and focused on his coffee, but he couldn't help overhearing their conversation. A few minutes later, the woman's voice broke the quiet hum of the diner. I think I forgot my wallet," she said softly, embarrassment creeping into her tone. "I'm so sorry. I didn't realize—" The waitress gave her a kind smile, but Ethan could tell the woman was deeply uncomfortable. Her cheeks flushed as she rummaged through her bag, hoping to find something, anything, to cover her meal. Without thinking twice, Ethan pulled a few crumpled bills from his pocket and waved the waitress over. "I got it," he said simply. The waitress looked at him in surprise. "You sure?" He nodded. "Yeah, it's not a big deal." The woman looked up, startled. "Oh, no, please," she said quickly. "You don't have to do that." "It's fine," Ethan replied with a small shrug. "Everyone forgets things sometimes." She hesitated for a moment, then gave him a small, grateful smile, one that completely transformed her face. "Thank you," she said softly. "You didn't have to, but thank you." Ethan just nodded and went back to his coffee, not wanting to make a big deal out of it. Helping people was second nature to him, and he wasn't looking for attention or praise. The woman finished her meal quietly. When she was done, she stood up and walked over to him, pulling a napkin from the dispenser. She hesitated, then met his gaze. "Thanks again," she said, her voice warm yet unreadable. Ethan had no idea that this small moment, this single act of kindness, was about to change everything. She scribbled something on the napkin and placed it in front of him. "Here's my number. I'd like to repay you somehow." Ethan looked at the napkin, surprised. "That's not necessary," he said. "Honestly, it was just a meal." "Maybe," she said with a small, shy smile. "But it meant more than you know. Call me sometime." And with that, she walked out, the bell above the diner's door jingling softly as she stepped back into the rain. Ethan picked up the napkin and read the name, Sophie. Below it, her phone number. He smiled to himself, wondering who this mysterious woman really was and why their brief encounter felt so important. Over the next few weeks, Ethan and Sophie got to know each other better. It started with a phone call, then a casual coffee meetup, and soon they were spending more and more time together. Sophie was warm, easy to talk to, and had a way of making Ethan feel comfortable. He found himself opening up to her in ways he hadn't with anyone else. He told her about his life as a mechanic, his struggles with money, and his dream of one day opening his own garage. Sophie listened closely, always encouraging him. She shared parts of her life too, though she was careful not to say too much. She mentioned that she worked in business but avoided details. For once, she wanted to keep things simple, to feel like a normal person. For the first time in a long time, someone cared about her for who she was, not for her status or wealth. But Sophie had a huge secret. She wasn't just an ordinary woman. She was the CEO of a billion-dollar company, often making headlines in magazines and news reports. She had spent years being treated differently because of her wealth, and she was terrified that telling Ethan the truth would ruin everything. She didn't want him to see her as a millionaire. She wanted him to see her as Sophie, the woman he met on a rainy night at a small diner. The truth came out one afternoon when Ethan decided to surprise her. He stopped by her apartment, bringing her favorite coffee. When he arrived, the door was slightly open, so he stepped inside, calling her name. But the moment he looked around, he froze. The apartment was massive, filled with expensive furniture, sleek decor, and artwork that probably cost more than his entire garage's rent for a year. On the coffee table lay a glossy magazine with Sophie's face on the cover. The headline read, "Sophie Lancaster, the Millionaire CEO Changing the Business World." Ethan stared at the magazine, his mind racing. The woman he had been falling for had been keeping a huge part of her life hidden from him. Just then, Sophie walked into the room and stopped in her tracks when she saw him holding the magazine. "Ethan," she said softly, "I can explain." He turned to her, his expression a mix of hurt and confusion. "Explain what?" "That you've been lying to me this whole time." "I wasn't lying," Sophie said quickly. I didn't want my money to get in the way. I was afraid you'd see me differently." "You didn't trust me," Ethan said, his voice quiet but firm. "You thought I'd care more about your money than about you." "That's not it," Sophie said, her eyes filling with tears. "I just wanted us to feel real. I didn't know how to tell you." Ethan shook his head, overwhelmed by emotions. "I thought I knew you, Sophie, but now I'm not so sure." He set the magazine down and walked out, leaving Sophie standing there, tears streaming down her face. For days, Ethan couldn't stop thinking about Sophie. He felt betrayed, but at the same time, he missed her terribly. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't deny the connection they had. One evening, as he sat alone in his small apartment, he found a letter in his mailbox. It was from Sophie. In the letter, she poured out her heart. She explained how lonely her life had been, how much she feared being judged for her wealth, and how badly she wished she had told him the truth sooner. She wrote about how much she cared for him, and how sorry she was for keeping her secret. "I fell in love with you, Ethan," the letter read, "because you see me for who I am, not what I have. I just hope you can forgive me." Ethan read the letter over and over, each word softening the anger he had been holding on to. He realized Sophie had been just as scared as he was. Maybe they both needed to let go of their fears. A few days later, Ethan heard about a gala Sophie was hosting. After much thought, he decided to go. He borrowed a suit from a friend, determined to face her. The grand hall was breathtaking, filled with elegantly dressed guests, chandeliers casting a golden glow over the crowd. Ethan scanned the room and finally spotted Sophie standing alone in a quiet corner, looking distant and sad. Taking a deep breath, he walked up to her. "Sophie," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. She turned, her eyes widening in surprise. "Ethan," she whispered. "I've been thinking," he said. "I was angry, but I realized I wasn't being fair to you either. I let my pride get in the way. I don't care about your money, I care about you." Tears welled up in Sophie's eyes. "You mean that?" she asked. "Yes," Ethan said. "I just want us to start fresh. No more secrets." A small, tearful smile spread across Sophie's face before she hugged him tightly. "You were always enough for me," she whispered. "I was just too scared to believe it." A few months later, Ethan's dream finally came true. He opened his own garage. It was something he had envisioned for years, and now it was real. The grand opening wasn't flashy, but it was perfect. Friends, family, and a few curious locals gathered around, watching as Ethan proudly stood beneath the freshly painted sign that read, Ethan's Auto Repair. The garage wasn't huge, but it was everything Ethan had ever wanted, a place where he could work with his hands, fix cars, and build a future doing what he loved. Sophie stood beside him, her face glowing with happiness. She had supported him every step of the way, encouraging him when doubts crept in and helping him navigate the challenges of starting his own business. Ethan had insisted on doing most of the work himself, but Sophie had quietly helped in the background, using her resources in ways he wouldn't notice. She didn't want the success to feel like it wasn't his. She just wanted to make the journey a little easier. As Ethan cut the ribbon in front of the small crowd, he glanced at Sophie. She was clapping and smiling, her eyes filled with pride. Through it all, she had been his rock, the one who believed in him even when he doubted himself. And in that moment, Ethan realized that what they had wasn't just love, it was a partnership, a shared dream they had built together. Inside the garage, tools were neatly organized and the smell of fresh paint lingered in the air. Ethan led his guests on a small tour, proudly showing them the space he had worked so hard for. Sophie stayed close, quietly cheering him on. As the sun began to set, Ethan looked at Sophie and smiled. "We did it," he said softly. "No," she replied, taking his hand. "You did it. I just stood by the man I believe in." Ethan squeezed her hand, knowing in that moment that their future was bright, built on love, trust, and the strength they had found in each other.